My name is Trey Dimsdale. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. It's an initiative of the First Liberty Institute. We're actually here in our offices in Washington, D.C., and we've pulled together this panel of natural law luminaries from different faith traditions so that we could have everybody in the same room. This is not a debate. This is a conversation between friends. There's not going to be sparks that fly today. But we're sensitive to the fact that there are both historical and contemporary tensions between the traditions that are represented. So we want to make sure that we have the best opportunity to play off of one another and to be sensitive to what those tensions might be. So we are going to start by going in essentially sort of chronological order from the beginning of these traditions. And so over the first portion of the webinar, each of our panelists, who I'll introduce in order as they speak, will provide a 12 to 15 minute sort of opening set of remarks that will introduce the natural law tradition from the perspective of their own religious tradition. And then I'll follow up with a handful of questions. There may be, as we go through this first portion, some interplay between the panelists, and that's fine. But please write down questions that you might have and submit those. And we will end with questions that come from our audience. So first, we have Dr. Danielle Mark, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Villanova University. He holds a BA, an MA, and a PhD from Princeton University. He's had visiting fellowships at Princeton and at the University of Notre Dame. And between 2014 and 2018, he served on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and as chairman from 2017 to 2018. He's also an affiliated scholar of the James Wilson Institute, and Dr. Mark is here to present some information for us on the Jewish tradition of natural law. Dr. Mark, thanks for being here with us.
Well, thank you so much. Hello and good afternoon to everyone. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you very much to the James Wilson Institute and the First Liberty Institute for having me. Before I can speak on this topic, on the topic of natural law and Judaism, I must pay tribute to the work of Professor David Novak of the University of Toronto, the preeminent contemporary scholar of Judaism and natural law. And he would be the preeminent scholar even if he were not the only one. Which brings me to an important disclaimer. In arguing for the existence and importance of natural law in Judaism, I represent something of an idiosyncratic position in my faith community, though I know I am not entirely alone in that at this gathering. Let me very briefly define a term. In this context, the only thing I mean by natural law is the idea that there are moral truths and that they are knowable by reason. This means that we as humans, using our rational capacity, can identify moral principles that are true just as such, and that, in virtue of being true, are universal, or apply to all people, in all places, and at all times. If I'm right, the teachings of Judaism in many ways embody and correspond to those universal truths, those universal moral truths, and therefore are relevant for all of humanity. I'll defer in my opening remarks that argument over the existence or not of natural law in Judaism to focus on what I think is at stake in that debate. There is what I'll call both the internal and external aspect to the stakes. Internally, the first thing at stake is the Jewish self-understanding, and in particular the self-understanding of Jewish chosenness and the Jewish mission. While Jews are not keenly interested in the conversion of non-Jews to Judaism, the Jews' commission, as it were, to be a light unto the nations, is, in my view, a call to witness to the existence of God and to the truth, beauty, and goodness of his ways. That is, it is a call to be ambassadors for what is sometimes referred to as ethical monotheism. And it is precisely natural law that makes God's moral law intelligible to and applicable to others. The second thing at stake, also internal, is our very understanding of God. Does the Jewish tradition speak to the most pressing ethical issues of the day? And what do we think of it when it does? Within modern Orthodoxy, and I'll come back to that term, there are debates over many of the usual social issues, questions over the role and status of women, and so on. The divide within modern Orthodoxy follows the usual fault lines between more traditional and more progressive strains of many religious groups. What distinguishes the dispute within Judaism from, say, the dispute within Catholicism, and this is a significant problem in my view, is the absence of any conscious, salient, systematic philosophical tradition from which to draw in defense of traditional ways. Therefore, statements from rabbinic associations mainly fall back on, well, tradition, as in, paraphrasing here, not quoting an actual statement, we have not done this thing historically, and therefore we are not ready to do it, at least for now. The problem is that this is not persuasive for those who see many other ways in which modern Orthodoxy has departed from traditional norms, at least in cases where there is no bright line prohibition. So, many left-leaning Orthodox Jews wonder why women cannot be rabbis in the same spirit of the, by some accounts at least, legitimate change that underwrites opportunities for advances in religious study that Jewish women never had in the past, but have today. With no rational explanation for a position on an ethically fraught issue, the rabbis leave the people with a God who is cruel and arbitrary, who promulgates biblical morality not for people's good, but instead with the same arbitrariness with which he prohibits garments made of wool and linen together, or permits eating beef, but not bacon, just to name two prohibitions that Orthodox Jews observe. In the Talmud, there is a distinction between chok and mishpat, between laws that are not rational, though not strictly speaking irrational either, such as rules concerning food and clothing, as I just mentioned, as well as ritual purity and much else. That's the chok. And rational laws, those that the Talmud said we would have written even if they had not been written, that's the mishpat. And for a defense of Orthodox Judaism in the modern world, even if that defense is directed entirely inward within the Orthodox Jewish community to its own members within the context of its own debates, it matters immensely that we understand the Jewish view of morality to be a matter of mishpat, a matter in the rational realm, the realm of natural law. The external aspect, which is highly relevant for our gathering today, is the importance of recognizing natural law in Judaism for forming what I'll call alliances outside the Jewish community. Seeing the moral law as rational and universal is the basis for grasping how we can make claims on our fellow citizens who share neither our theological nor our moral views. And it is the basis for finding common ground and making common cause with those who do share our moral views, but not our theological views. In other words, it is the basis, natural law, is the basis for some of our most consequential civic activity in a pluralistic society. Yet, unless Jews see the principles of God's moral law as the inheritance of all of humanity, they will lack both the impetus and the language for building together a society anchored in those truths. That's right. The need for building alliances, or put better, being a light unto the nations in the distinct way I mean here, is even more acute when we see that the task falls to a minority of a minority within the Jewish people, to modern Orthodoxy, which I mentioned before, because it is uniquely situated with respect to the challenges that modern society presents to believing Jews. Of the three major Jewish denominations, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, Orthodoxy represents the most traditional, or small o, Orthodox. Orthodoxy, in turn, can be divided into modern Orthodoxy and ultra-Orthodoxy. Although there are no perfect definitions, ultra-Orthodoxy is characterized by its strict instrumental engagement with the wider culture, an in-principle rejection of the intrinsic value of the philosophy, literature, art, and so forth of non-Jewish civilization. Modern Orthodoxy, by contrast, accepts that there can be knowledge and pursuits that are intrinsically worthwhile outside the Jewish community. For this reason, modern Orthodoxy welcomes engagement with the wider culture, ideally without compromising tradition and transmission, whereas ultra-Orthodoxy tries to minimize engagement and maximize insularity. Furthermore, unlike conservative and Reform Judaism, modern Orthodoxy theoretically opposes many secularizing progressive trends in favor of tradition, while at the same time, unlike ultra-Orthodoxy, engages extensively with the world that is grappling with those issues. So, whereas ultra-Orthodoxy mostly refuses to acknowledge or address the conflicts, and the more liberal denominations embrace the cultural changes and effectively have no conflicts, modern Orthodoxy, by contrast, chooses to live in the world but not of the world, to coin a phrase. While you may have gotten more than you bargained for there as far as Jewish sociology, the important takeaway is that only a very small portion of the Jewish world is in a position to witness in the way I am discussing. So at the very least, that group needs to be well equipped. Yet it is not. Indeed, I think it is fair to say that among Jews, including modern Orthodox Jews, very few know what natural law is. Neither the phrase nor the concept is part of a standard Jewish education. After K through 12 Jewish education, I first heard the term from my Catholic freshman year college roommate, who is now a numerary in Opus Dei. Among those who have heard of natural law, very few know what it has to do with Judaism. And among those who do know, most of those deny that it does have anything to do with Judaism. And even among the few who do accept some natural law content in Judaism, they probably do not agree where and what it is, or at least try to minimize its scope and relevance. Why is this the case? Let me offer 4 non-mutually exclusive theories to explain the absence or even denial of natural law in Judaism today. 1. There is natural law in Judaism, but it was always assumed or taken for granted, and therefore never made explicit. Then, over time, it was overlooked and essentially forgotten. Underlying assumptions are often implicit, and this may be a particular hazard in a tradition that was self-consciously oral, and in its first written instantiations was intentionally abbreviated and even cryptic. Furthermore, the more extended early writings are characterized by an emphasis on legal arguments and legends, more than on the derivation or development of philosophical principles. I think this is evident in the divergence between, on one hand, Rabbinic Judaism's unfolding of a minutely detailed legal tradition, and on the other hand, the Church's intricate philosophical tradition, to perhaps the benefit and detriment of both. 2. Although there is natural law in Judaism, Jewish thought has sufficiently lost sight of its own natural law tradition that the rediscovery of such seems much more like the importation of a foreign system, and specifically, to name some enemies as it were, a Greek, Roman, or Christian one. It doesn't sound kosher. 3. The medieval rabbis disagreed about whether there should be a project of trying to speculate about the reasons behind God's commandments. On the negative side, a con, one concern was, and is, that Jews are supposed to keep the commandments just because God commanded them. Looking for reasons, with the attendant suggestion that there needs to be a reason, and our observance depends on our assessment of the reasons, feels impious. 4. Looking for reasons might also be imprudent. While it could motivate observance if the reasons that we find appear solid, it could also undermine observance if the reasons appear weak or inapplicable. But, to combine two aphorisms of the late St. John Paul II the Great, to all of this I say, be not afraid. Truth cannot contradict truth. To be sure, there is a fifth possibility, namely that there isn't natural law in Judaism, or at least not as much as I'd like. And we can find evidence for this, in some cases, in the consequentialist reasoning that attends to various points of Jewish law. But I would contest this one, obviously, and with David Novak, I think the sources, and perhaps we'll discuss them later, are on our side. If I'm right about the stakes of recognizing the place of natural law in Judaism, and if I'm right that the Jewish intellectual tradition has a lot of catching up to do in this regard, then the task before us is a tall one. But all the more reason, then, that it is fruitful to engage in discussions like this one here today, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mark. Our next panelist is Dr. Hadley Arkes. Dr. Arkes is the founder and director of the James Wilson Institute. He also has emeritus status as the Edward Ney Professor of Jurisprudence at Amherst College. He holds a BA from the University of Illinois, a PhD from the University of Chicago. He's the author of more than half of a dozen books, and his newest book will be out later this year from Regnery called Mere Natural Law. Dr. Arkes is representing today his views on natural law as they're informed by the Catholic tradition.
Thanks, Trey. Now, it was my understanding that we're supposed to give an account of how we came to the understanding of natural law, what we understand it to be, and how it's woven in with our religious commitments. In the library of my late father-in-law, I came across a biblical commentary by Meyer Waxman on that passage in Kings 1, when Elijah was lodged at Mount Horeb, and God tells him to go to Damascus and install Hazael as ruler over Aram, or Syria. And Waxman said that this story, dating from about 9th century BCE, was an indication of how early the Jews were committed to monotheism. So I thought we were always monotheists, but as David Novak said, no, there's a time when they were henotheists. There's a God of Israel along with other gods. And I put the question to my students, what is there in this story that conveys the logic of monotheism? Well, the God who can tell a prophet to move across a jurisdictional line, to cashier or install summoner in other places, obviously not one of those local gods known to antiquity. It was a God of a universal jurisdiction. And we don't think that the Ten Commandments were really municipal regulations about the immediate vicinity of Mount Sinai. It was a God who was an author of universal law of physics, so we don't think that God would have given us a system of laws for Zanzibar and Jersey City. Now, I have to say that this was not a matter that drew much of my curiosity as a youngster. It wasn't until I was drawn on to graduate school, and I became interested in the work of Hans Morgenthau in power politics in the defense of the national interest. But of course, it gave rise to a moral question that we're not defending the national interest simply a territory, but a certain regime, a certain way of life grounded in certain principles. And the question was always there as to whether the national interests were directed to good or bad ends. Now, when I arrived at Chicago, though, the most magnetic figure there was Leo Strauss, whom I met now 60 years ago. And it was said in the past, some people were speculating that Strauss was a closet atheist. I can say that understanding was dissolved in the first 10 minutes I was with him. You can imagine the situation of a ascending room, hemicircle, and who's in the room? Some gray-haired retired figures from the military, some young Catholic seminarians, and some very aggressive young Jewish kids from Chicago. If you ask, what do these people have in common? Well, they're standing with Strauss contra mundum against the currents of relativism that were gaining force in the culture. So Strauss would draw both on the biblical tradition and on the classical tradition. He'd draw both on Jerusalem and Athens in making the resistance to cultural relativism. Now, it was said that Socrates brought philosophy down out of the clouds as he brought it to bear on questions of right and wrong and the just and the unjust. And it was Harry Jaffa who brought Strauss out of the clouds for me. Because what he managed to show in his classic book, Christ of the House Divided, is how that question of relativism came to bear on the gravest crisis we've ever had in this regime, the crisis of our house divided. And as Jaffa showed, what was at issue most movingly in these debates was whether those rights mentioned in the Declaration of Independence had a natural foundation, true in all places and all times, or would they simply vary according to the conventions and opinions of the powers that were dominant in any place? Now, Lincoln's argument, of course, ran back to the founding, where the argument ran in this way, that no man is by nature the ruler of other men, in the way God is by nature the ruler of men, and men are by nature the rulers of dogs and horses. So when the question was put, where in the world would it be wrong to rule human beings in the way the human beings are compelled to rule dogs and horses? The answer was everywhere where that difference in nature remained the same. Hence the notion of natural rights, rights grounded in enduring nature of human beings. Lincoln provided, my experience of teaching natural law, Lincoln provided the kind of example. I've never seen an example like this, which when heard was more instantly understood. Lincoln wrote a fragment for himself, imagining himself engaged in a conversation with an owner of slaves, putting the question, why you justify making a slave of the black man? Is it because he's less intelligent than you? Beware, the next white man who comes along, more intelligent than you, may rightly enslave you. Is it because he's darker than you? The light having the right to enslave the darker? Beware again, the next white man who comes along, with a complexion even lighter than yours, may have a right to enslave you. There was nothing one could cite to disqualify the black man as a rights-bearing being that would not apply to many whites. And so this drew up precisely the same mode of principled reasoning when it came to abortion. Why is that offspring in the womb anything less than human? Doesn't speak yet, neither do deaf mutes. Doesn't have arms or legs. Other people lose arms or legs in the course of their lives, not losing anything necessary to their standing as human beings to receive the protections of the law. The upshot is there's nothing one could cite to disqualify the fetus as human being that would not apply to many people walking around well outside the womb. Now, at no point was there a move to revelation or to faith. This was a mode of principled reasoning that was accessible across the religious division to Catholics, Protestants, atheists, backgammon players. I mean, everybody could understand this. And therefore, you see, in other words, you don't have to be Catholic in order to understand this argument. But that was precisely the teaching of the Church, that these moral arguments not depend on faith or revelation. It depends on that reasoning that is accessible to human beings as human beings. Well, I was not yet Catholic, but I was making myself an oddity at Amherst by taking this line, and I created a course in Amherst called Political Obligations. We said we spend so much time dealing with things that are problematic, we ought to spend some time reminding ourselves that those moral truths we know, but which also cannot be otherwise. And the course of doing that particular course, I would have incidents of this kind. I'd have Ned Desmond, posted by Time magazine in Tokyo, writing to say, you know, it was that work we did on natural law that drew me back into the church. Or Sam Rudman saying at Amherst class of 09, moving into the church already as on the strength of that natural law reasoning. And I think the sense you're moving them is that if the church standing contra mundum has this critical matter right, we have confidence that the church has the rest of the thing right. Well, as Robbie George said, because as with Chesterton, my writings were bringing people into the church before I finally came over. And I came back to the church that became the main enclave to sustain natural law reasoning at a time when the currents of relativism We're corroding all other institutions, including the churches and the colleges. Stuart Sweatland, Monsignor Sweatland, was giving a talk in town, and he mentioned he converted to Catholicism at Oxford because of conversations with Robbie George and Dermot Quinn. Robbie George said he didn't know what persuaded him. Dermot Quinn, he said, it was Dermot. Dermot told me, you could believe everything the church tells you and not be a good Catholic. The question is whether you believe in the church as a truth-telling institution. And that caught me. Because I really do. I really do believe when the church stands contra mundum against my betting is the church has it right. And his late father Birch used to say, the church holds up a mirror to you and say, look, this is what you're going to look like down the road if you continue on this path. No surprises. We've seen this all before. One of the ironies of our time has been why Christians have been so suspicious of natural law in giving us access to moral truths quite apart from what has been revealed. But see, why don't we understand that the laws of reason, uniquely accessible to creatures of reason, why the laws of reason and the creatures are capable of unfolding those laws of reason are as much a part of the creation as the laws of physics, springing from the same creator who made the land and the waters and finally brought forth us as the very peak of creation, the last thing made. But again, the natural law is accessible to human beings as human beings, quite across the religious conviction, the religious division. And yet, something else critical must be added to explain those things that are natural, that we can't get from a syllogism. And I'd supplied a couple of stories, one story, which I used in my book, Natural Rights and the Right to Choose. I recall having a commission to do a piece on the Holocaust Museum here in Washington. And I was visiting the museum. I took a turn, probably encountered by other people here, and I came across this vat filled with shoes. The shoes of the victims, which the Nazis thought they could salvage or sell again, make use of. And what came flashing back at that moment were those searing lines of Justice McLean in the Dred Scott decision. He leaned in and said, you may think that black man is gentle, but he's a creature made in the image of his maker. He's amenable to the laws of God and man, and he is destined to an endless existence. But as he has a soul that will not decompose when his material existence comes to an end. I said, you could take the measure of the whole thing and saying that the Nazis looked at this situation, they thought the shoes were the durables. They thought the shoes were the durables. Lincoln put it another way when he said, nothing made in the graven image was sent into this world to be embruted and trod upon. And what McLean and Lincoln reflected were the things that had been supplied to us mainly through our religious teaching that we don't get from the classics, we don't get from the Greeks. The anchoring point is how we understand that forked creature who conjugates verbs. We understand that as a moral agent and a rights-bearing being. Nothing else can account for why we consider the taking of human life, or the removal of freedom, or the confiscation of property from those beings as momentous things that must engage our sympathy and command us to protect them through the force of law. And so here is the ironic point, I think, not adequately appreciated. The freedom of religion arises today in our politics most critically as a plea to be exempted from the laws that mandate the support of contraception and abortion, transgenderism. And people seek their freedom from those kinds of commitments, and rightly so. But our religious tradition, I'd argue, does not enter our law, most importantly, as a claim to be exempted from the laws, rightful or wrongful, that are imposed on everyone else. It enters our tradition far more deeply by stamping the people around us as rights-bearing beings whose lives and freedom. Green, in the famous Hobby Lobby case, not to have his private assets and his business commandeered by the government, making him more complicit in the support of contraception and abortion. When we support the right of Mr. Green not to have his private assets or property commanded their use. That defense of green as a bearer of constitutional right does not stand in any moral plane of lesser dignity than his right to live by the religious teaching that commands his obligation. The Chesterton put this another way, and you see remark that the church has not always said on behalf of democracy what Walt Whitman or Lincoln and Jefferson said. He said, it will be the rending of all civil peace and perhaps civilization itself before the church would say that one single moron or that one single man is not worth saving.
Thank you, Dr. Arkes. Our third panelist is Dr. Jordan Balor. Dr. Ballor is my colleague at the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. He serves as our Director of Research, as well as the Executive Editor of our Journal of Religion, Culture, and Democracy. He holds a Doctor of Theology and Reformation History from the University of Zurich, a PhD in Moral Theology from Calvin Theological Seminary. He's also served as the series editor of Lexham Press's very popular collected works in public theology of Abraham Kuyper. Dr. Balor is presenting from a Protestant and Reformed perspective. Thank you for joining us today, Jordan.
Well, thanks for having me, Trey, and I've already learned so much. I'm looking forward to the rest of our conversation. I'm very sensitive to the fact that a number of the panelists up here, I think, have a higher burden of proof. I'm not a lawyer or an attorney, but I think of that kind of standard. What kind of standard do we have to meet to show that our tradition that we speak from has a vibrant understanding or set of resources for affirming natural law? Of all of us, I think maybe the most intuitive connection there is between Catholicism and natural law. In many people's minds, you think of natural law, you immediately think of Catholicism. Not so much Judaism. Perhaps you think of Protestantism, but maybe it's the loud no that you hear echoing from Karl Bart through the recent decades when you think of Protestantism and natural law, and the same for Islam and natural law. So I'm very honored to be part of this panel and attempt to make the beginnings of a case, or at least the sketch of a case, largely historical for a positive relationship between natural law and Protestantism. I'm going to start that historical case with an appeal to authority. It's not just an appeal to a mere authority, but an authority and, in fact, a recommendation of the source that you can evaluate his treatment of the materials on his own. John McNeill, the Reformation scholar and the contributor to an edition of Calvin's Institutes in the 20th century, wrote the following in an article on natural law and the teaching of the Reformers. This is what he said. There is no real discontinuity between the teaching of the Reformers and that of their predecessors with respect to natural law. That's what McNeill concluded. And in mind here, he has the magisterial reformers. So he's thinking about Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon and Ulrich Zwingli and Calvin and Martin Butzer, Heinrich Bullinger. Others he doesn't name would also fit in this category. Peter Martyr Vermigli, Jerome Zanchi, Wolfgang Musculus. It's significant that many of those names are not going to be very well known. Maybe you recognized a couple of them, Luther and Calvin, perhaps. It's also true, McNeill's conclusion, in later generations following those early years of the Reformation. It's true for figures like Francis Junius, Francis Turretin, Richard Baxter, Peter von Maastricht, and a number of others, usually associated with the era of Reformed Orthodoxy in the 16th, later 16th and early 17th centuries. Now, of course, from a Reformed understanding, it is important what luminaries like this think and taught and said and wrote about the natural law. But there's a qualitative difference between, say, Calvin's pastoral writings or his biblical commentaries or even his institutes and a document that has a confessional status that people actually would have to adhere to become office bearers or confessing members of a church. And this is why the Reformed confessions are so important in understanding what the official teachings of the Reformed tradition are historically. It's interesting to look at these documents and to see what they say about realities like natural theology and natural revelation and natural law, the moral component of those other realities. Perhaps counterintuitively, one of the key places to look in the Reformed tradition for an affirmation, a positive affirmation of the natural law, is in the canons of Dort, those documents from the early 17th century that are so often associated with debates about predestination and salvation. The canons of Dort are very explicit in affirming that even in a post-fallen situation, even in the context of sin, that there remain aspects of God's image that are operative in all human people. This is what the canons say. There remain, however, in man since the fall, the glimmerings of natural light, whereby he retains some knowledge of God, of natural things, and of the difference between good and evil, and shows some regard for virtue and for good outward behavior. But so far as this light of nature from being sufficient to bring him to a saving knowledge of God and to true conversion, that he is incapable of using it aright, even in things natural and civil. Now that's an important point there at that second half of that phrase, natural and civil. In some ways, that is perhaps the characteristic contribution of a Protestant or specifically Reformed understanding of natural law, that it's a kind of a qualified affirmation. It's an affirmation, yes, but it's a limited affirmation, or it's an affirmation within certain constraints about the efficacy and to what uses we might put the natural law. The Heidelberg Catechism, an earlier document in the Reformed tradition, talks about the law in a number of ways, but one of them is as a guide for the gratitude in the Christian life. The Belgian Confession, another document from the Reformed tradition, talks about two different books in which God communicates to us, the book of creation and the book of Holy Scripture. So Article 2 of the Belgian Confession, for example, it says, "We know him, that is God, by two means. First, by the creation, preservation, and government of the universe, which is before our eyes as a most elegant book, wherein all creatures, great and small, are as so many characters, leading us to see clearly the invisible things of God, even his everlasting power and divinity, as the Apostle Paul says." And that's from the first chapter of Romans. "All which things are sufficient to convince men and leave them without excuse." So we might just briefly look at these as a kind of set of examples of the affirmation, a measured kind of qualified affirmation of the existence of natural law, its efficacy in at least leaving men without excuse and sufficiently convincing them of God's existence, as Article 2 of the Belgian Confession says. So we might say here in summary, the Reformed affirm the ontology of natural law, the existence of natural law, with some important qualifications, as I've said, about the epistemology and practical implications. Now, the Reformed are unanimous that natural law exists, it's known enough to leave human beings without excuse, and it also does have some positive consequences. Natural law manifests itself in some ways among non-Christians, including institutions that we can point to like family and government. Luther famously says, of course, that there's marriage even among the pagans. The natural law also functions positively as a guide for the Christian life, as we've said, and these correspond roughly to the three uses of the law that come out of Reformation teaching, associated most closely with Melanchthon and Calvin. It's important here, too, I think, to keep in mind an important set of distinctions between types of good. So you'll read in different Reformed theologians or in different confessions that man can do no good, or that there are certain kinds of good that he can do, or she can do. Arising out of the Reformation in a kind of systematic way, so I'm going to set this up as a kind of systematic way of thinking about it. There's at least three different types of good that we can talk about. Civil or moral good on one level, Christian good on a second level, and saving good on a third level. The natural law, as understood by the Reformed tradition, affirms the existence of civil or moral good that is achievable by all people on the basis of their nature, even fallen nature. Right? This is despite some of the more polemic or unqualified claims about being able to do no good. When these confessional documents are talking about human beings incapable of any good, basically you shouldn't understand that as referring to that first category of good. It's usually almost always talking about these other two categories of good. Christian good is that which is only able to be done by Christians. So from a Reformed perspective, a Protestant perspective, the Holy Spirit regenerates the human person, fulfilling and restoring in a more fulsome fashion the natural image of God that had been lost to some extent in the fall, allowing Christians working out of a true faith, in accordance with the law of God and for the right purposes for his glory, to do some good that is qualitatively, in that sense, different than just mere civil or moral good. And then, of course, there's yet a third distinction that I've said between that kind of good that Christians can do and saving good, meritorious good. And of course, from a Christian perspective, at least a Reformed perspective, only Christ is able to do that kind of good, the kind of good that merits salvation for the fallen. So this is an important set of categories to keep in mind, because you'll see often treatments of the Reformed tradition that deal with some of these documents or sources that I've looked at and read them in kind of a straightforward way, saying, well, man is a totally depraved, the phrase you often hear associated with the Reformed tradition. I would affirm that, rightly understood, right? It does not mean that human beings in a fallen state can do no good in any sense whatsoever. It's talking about the inability of human beings to do certainly saving good or Christian good in that more elevated and particular sense that I was just describing. So going back to McNeill for a moment, we've already seen McNeill's claim that there's no real discontinuity between the Reformers and that of the church leading up to the time of the Reformation. There is in this way continuity between the medieval period and the diversity of its philosophical and theological positions regarding natural law and different Protestant traditions. These differences tend not to be exclusively confessional, but cross-confessional, so there are interesting dynamics among and between Protestants, say on the one hand between the Reformed and the Remonstrants or the Arminians, and these are matters of dispute among Roman Catholics as well, between, say, Dominicans and Jesuits. So how did we get to where we are now in the popular understanding of the Protestant traditions and the Reformed tradition specifically, and a negative assessment of natural law? Well, that's a much longer story. We don't have time for all of it today, but a big part of that has to do with changes in the late 19th and early 20th century in the self-understanding of Protestant traditions, or at least the ascendancy of different views about Reformed identity at that time. In that sense, it has to do not so much with theology and doctrine primarily as with shifting institutional and philosophical context within which theology was being articulated and pursued. By the 18th century, there's a collapse of a broad cross-confessional Christian consensus of a kind of Christian Aristotelianism or Peripateticism, and diverse attempts by various Christian traditions and figures to reground Christian theology in different philosophical terms, some of which increasingly move away from arguments and affirmations of teleology and narrow the range of causality. I'm just going to say a little bit more and moving ahead and trying to get this story up to date. So an important figure, I don't think he's been mentioned yet, maybe if he has only in passing, is Thomas Aquinas, as you might imagine, in this story of the Reformation and its relationship to Roman Catholicism. As opposed to many 20th century historiographical accounts of the Reformation, Thomas is actually, just like natural law, appreciated in many ways more positively than would otherwise be thought by the theologians, some of whom I've already named in the 16th and 17th century. You know, in order to make a case for reform, that something needs to change, you have to have a kind of a decline narrative. You have to explain how did things get so bad, right? Luther's got a decline narrative, Calvin has a decline narrative. Many of these narratives distinguish between the so-called sounder scholastics of the medieval period and the later scholastics, and they almost always include Thomas among the sounder scholastics. Now, by the 19th century, in the Reformed tradition, we're so far removed in terms of time and sensibility from the era of the Reformation that the Catholicity of the Reformation is no longer as much of an existential concern, right? It's becoming more and more important culturally and for various other reasons to define yourself over against those with whom we disagree, especially Roman Catholics. At the same time, you've got a kind of neo-Thomist revival in the Roman Catholic Church under Leo XIII. Aeterni Patris lifts up Thomas, and modern Catholic social teaching comes into formulation beginning in 1891 with Rerum Novarum. So at the same time that Roman Catholicism is sort of rediscovering its Thomistic roots and foregrounding Thomas, Protestants in some response, in some ways responding to that are saying, well, yeah, of course you can have Thomas. He's not ours anyway. In a way that the 16th century reformers would have said. You've also got the attendant polemic and historiographical concerns that reinforce this kind of thesis and reading. Scholarship associated with figures like Lortz and Pinkers and Weaver and McIntyre and more recently Brad Gregory. I'll conclude by just saying a little bit about the Bart-Bruner debate of 1934. So this is a famous kind of watershed moment in Protestant ethics. It's a debate between Karl Barth and Emil Bruner, both in some sense reformed, or at least nominally reformed, about the status of natural theology and attendant doctrines like natural law. The 20th century Presbyterian John Bailey says this in evaluation of this debate. He says, Dr. Bart's position seems to me untrue to the facts, but clearly argued. Dr. Bruner's position seems nearer to the truth, but because it is not sufficiently far advanced beyond the other to be involved in confusion and unreal compromise. The reality is that by most accounts, Bart is the winner of this debate, at least rhetorically, and certainly given the context of the rise of Nazism and National Socialism in Germany, Bart has the greater influence on the subsequent trend of Protestant ethics through the end of the 20th century. That story is not quite over, though. Just over 15 years ago, a colleague of mine at the Acton Institute, where we were both working at the time, named Stephen Grable, came out with a book called Rediscovering the Natural Law and Reformed Theological Ethics. I'm not going to say too much more about that book, but that came out, just as I said, over 15 years ago in 2006. And that really, I think, helped inaugurate and reinvigorate Protestant, and particularly Reformed, but more broadly evangelical engagement with the natural law over the last decade and a half. There's an essay I've got on that, a kind of appreciation for this book that's, I think, going to come out in public discourse at some point in the next couple weeks. So I'll leave it there for now, and hopefully we can return to some of these points if there are further questions or points of discussion. But that's sort of where we came from and where we're going, or at least how we got to where we are in my brief sketch of the Reformed tradition and natural law. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jordan. Our last panelist is Mustafa Akyol. Mustafa is a senior fellow for the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity at the Cato Institute. He worked as a professional journalist in his native Turkey and is a regular contributor to the New York Times. His writings appeared in many global outlets, including most major outlets here in the United States. He holds an undergraduate degree in international relations and a master's degree in history that he received from Turkish universities. And in the 2017-2018 academic year, was visiting fellow at Wellesley College near Boston. He's also the author of two recent books, one that's published by Cato called Why, as a Muslim, I Defend Liberty, and this excellent book that came out in 2021, Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance, from St. Martin's. Mustafa, we're glad to have you here, and he will be representing the Islamic tradition of natural law.
Thank you so much, Trey, and thanks to the James Wilson Institute and the First Liberty Institute again for me as well for hosting us here. I'm, as I understand, speaking from the Islamic perspective, and that is the last of the great traditions, hopefully not the least, but But one thing that I would like to emphasize, that being the last great monotheistic tradition, Islam is actually very much on the first page with the first one, which is Judaism, in the sense of being a very legal or legalistic religion. In other words, Islam has a strong sense of religious law, which is the Sharia, which is very much actually modeled on the halakha. In many ways, from dietary laws to observance to practice to criminal laws and a lot of various aspects of human legality. One historical big difference is that halakha has been cut off from state power in the past 2,000 years for reasons Jews didn't want or anticipate, but that was historically the case. Whereas the Sharia has been
backed by state power until recently, and still there are groups who think that it should be the land of the law of the land imposed by the state. So because of this, because of the primacy of revealed law, which is the Sharia expressed by the Quran and the example of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in Islam too, natural law has not been a strong concept. I mean, as a Muslim, I had never heard about it actually, and the first place I ever heard about natural law was a dozen years ago at the Acton Institute. I was speaking for the first time as a guest speaker on Islam and liberty, and at the end of the conference, somebody asked me, "What's the state of natural law in Islam?" And I said, "Like, what do you mean, like gravity or like something like that?" Then I realized that these Catholics were speaking about something called "What is this about?" And that actually initiated my own research on this topic that grew over the years. That is why today, if you ask what's the state of natural law to many Muslims, most of them will not be familiar with the concepts. There are people who know, of course, but it's not a part of the Islamic education as well. And actually, I've seen Islamic commentaries saying that, well, Christians had to struggle with this natural law thing because they don't have what we have, which is the revealed law. So, I mean, we are the complete religion, so we have everything already set up, so we don't have to struggle with that thing. Which is, of course, not the only way to look at this issue, as I will now try to explain. Now, in Islam, my sense is that, yes, it's not there as a very strong established tradition, but it doesn't mean that there are no sources of it, or there are no illusions of it, or there are no roots of it. There are. And I think in my book, Reopening Muslim Minds, a part of the discussion or argument is discovering what you could identify as sources of natural law in Islam. Now, this takes us back to some early theological discussions in Islam, and one of the most interesting early theological discussions in Islam, which I dig into in my book in the chapter Islam's Beautiful Dilemma, was this very interesting theological dispute on the meaning of husn and qubh, as in Arabic, which means beauty and ugliness, or good and bad. Muslim theologians discussed that Sharia shows us what is good and bad, like killing is wrong, or helping a person in need is good and right. But does the Sharia indicate this, or does it constitute this? Now, two views existed in early Islam. According to the theological school known as the Mu'tazila, generally called the rationalists of Islam, they were rationalists not in the sense of secular rationalists, but they believed that reason, apart from revelation, can also establish ethical value. So they said Sharia indicates right and wrong, which could have been known otherwise. For example, Qadi Abdul al-Jabbar, which is the greatest Mu'tazila scholar from the 11th century, he has a saying. He says, prohibition from God is an indication that something is evil, as the indicator indicates the thing as it is. Not that it becomes what it is by indication. Like, murder is bad, it's there, and Sharia is reminding us, educating about this thing. Therefore, according to the Mu'tazila, even if there was no revelation, there would be still morality. So before revelation, that's the term, Qabla al-Sharia, which is before revelation, is there ethical value? Mu'tazila said yes. Now, the opposite view was supported by the school called Asharism. It comes from a scholar whose name was Ashari. And it came in the 9th century, but in the 11th century, for example, al-Baqillani was an important figure in the school, and he says, all acts are evil only because they are evil by way of revelation. If revelation did not make them evil, they would not be evil. So murder is wrong because God said so, it's wrong. If he said it was right, it would be right. Luckily he said so, and we can have a connection with that. But his Sharia establishes it. Now, ultimately, these disputes went on in classical Islam. Asharism became the dominant Sunni theology. Why that was, and Mu'tazila was cast aside as a heretical group, basically. Some of their ideas survived, actually. They had some influence on Shiite tradition. They had some influence on the Maturidi school in Islam, which became influential in the Ottoman landscape in Central Asia. But the mainstream Sunni view has been established by Ash'arism, which brought this idea of voluntarism or divine command theory. Sharia establishes value. That's why Ash'arites rejected that before revelation there's any ethical value. So value is established by revelation. Now, why is this the case? Why did this happen is a big question. My answer is, it was a lot of politics there. I mean, Ash'arism won the backing of the political authority. That helped a lot, especially when you have an empire that establishes the orthodoxy. But actually, if you look at it from a Quranic point of view, you can well make the argument that the Quran actually stands closer to not divine command theory, but the other view, which is also called ethical objectivism. For example, Quran tells Muslims to do justice or good or stay away from badness without defining what those are. So that's why scholars like Khalid Abu Fadl says the Quran presumes that its reader has a degree of moral sense. Also, the Quran describes itself as a reminder of the things that they should know. Also, the Quran defines goodness as maruf, which means known, something that is known by maybe reason. So it wasn't necessarily the scripture itself, but it was a post-scriptural struggle that established these boundaries and these disputes. Now, there's one silver lining though, even within Ash'arism, in a later stage in Ash'arism that scholars call it the late Ash'aris, that were more sophisticated, more nuanced, more rational, beginning with Al-Ghazali, and it continued later. There was at least a kind of balance brought to voluntarism, and that was the idea that yes, before revelation there is no value, but revelation tells us commandments, and we can still understand the intention behind the commandments, the rationale of the commandments. God is saying these things, and there's a reason behind that, and that's intelligible. That gave us the theory of maqasid, or higher objectives of Islamic law. That's the theory. Scholars said there are 5 values of Sharia, actually: protection of life, religion, property, lineage, and the intellect. Like God bans wine because He wants to protect the intellect, because if you get drunk, we can do wrong things, so the intellect has to be protected. Now, in the modern era, this maqasid theory has been revived and discovered by reformists in Islamic law, saying that this is the basis on which we can move on. But the views about this are disputed, because ultimately the maqasid was inferred from the law itself. Can it be used to go back to the law and to change that? There are 2 different views. And scholar Anwar Emon has written a lot about this. He's one of the leading, I think, scholars on this issue. And he calls it soft natural law in Islam, whereas Mu'tazila was the hard natural law. Although others disagree with Anwar Emon, and this is a niche topic, in scholarship. And I think Maryam Attar from the Sunni perspective, and Ali Reza Bojani from the Shiite perspective has written a lot about these issues. So this is a new thing that is coming up. Why it is coming up? Because there are tensions between classical interpretations of the Sharia and liberty and religious liberty, like apostasy laws, like blasphemy laws. And again, if you implemented halakha as it was written 3,000 years ago, you would have problems too, but that's obsolete. I mean, but for the Taliban, those things are not obsolete, right? I mean, apostasy, blasphemy, all these things are there. So that's why reviving or revisiting Islamic law from a natural law perspective is something that people are working on, and I mean, in Islamic. Now, in my view, there is one interesting scholar in the history of Islam that really had a fascinating view on this, which is little known, but has been recently, again, by scholars being highlighted. And that person is Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes. He is what you can call what Thomas Aquinas, was for Catholicism, and I think Maimonides was for Judaism. He was the great Aristotelian thinker in classical Islam. Actually, through him, Aristotle came back to Europe, mainly. Through his works, it was translated, and then it moved into France and initiated a whole movement of Averroism.
And I think he was understood more accurately among Jews, by the way, more than the Christians, because he was understood a bit as if he was a secular thinker among Christians, which was not necessarily the case. But anyway, Averroes, the thing about it is, he was a philosopher, but he was also a qadi and jurist, a faqih. So he was also, his job was to interpret and implement Islamic law. So he was an Islamic scholar as well. So he has a very interesting passage in his commentary on Aristotle's rhetoric. He says, in passing, in a passage, laws are two kinds. Laws are of two kinds. There are written laws and unwritten laws. And for unwritten laws, he uses the Arabic term sunan ghair maktuba, which is unwritten sunnah, which is what we Muslims use for religious law. That's the Sharia. The unwritten laws are in the nature of all people. They are what all people consider just or unjust by nature, although they had no explicit stipulation or contract among one another. Natural law. Now he says, in another passage, continues, no one can lay down universal and general laws according to all people of all times and places. So if you write down a law, it can never be valid for everybody if you write the law. This, he adds, sometimes calls for an addition or a subtraction of written laws based on unwritten laws. What it's saying is that, well, if you have texts, written laws, which the Sharia is, and Islamic jurisprudence is, it can be applicable in a certain place, but it cannot be universally applicable. However, the unwritten law that's in the nature, that is universally applicable. So you could use the natural law basically to edit and to correct the written laws. Right. Now, scholars like Karen Talifiero and Ferri al-Bouhafa wrote on this recently, and I owe to their articles and scholarly books on this. And I show in my book how Ibn Rushd applied this way of thinking to discussions about jihad in medieval Islam. He has a passage where he criticizes Muslims who believe in perpetual and aggressive jihad, and he says this kind of understanding will lead to great harm. The Creator could not have intended this harm, so peace is more praiseworthy. So he shows how actually, with a sense of natural law, some of the written laws, which he sees as contextual, can be corrected. So my sense is that natural law in Islam is an untapped resource for many reasons, because of the dominance of the Ash'arite theology and the dominance of the jurisprudential tradition built on that, which is very textualist. But more and more there's growing interest, and there are sources like the great Ibn Rushd and the Mu'tazila scholars, and even the Maturidi scholars, which is also getting some interest in the past few decades among Muslim intelligentsia, that we can use to build a case for Islamic law, which can help us reinterpret some aspects of Sharia that are in tension with what we call human rights today.
Wow.
All right. Thank you, Mustafa. So for those of you who are watching from a distance, go ahead and submit questions. We're going to pose a few questions to the panelists. And while those are coming in, we're going to sort through the questions that are coming in from you and pose them to these panelists as well. So the first question that I have, and we can just sort of open this up for whoever feels like they've got sort of the most productive response. I'll ask first a question that's somewhat, I think, sort of theologically informed by each tradition. To what extent does the perspective on natural law from your tradition depend upon an understanding of the human person? So the theologically informed anthropology from your tradition, how much does a natural law tradition depend upon that as sort of as a fundamental commitment, or is it a fundamental commitment?
Sure, of course. It's what John Paul II called the human person, the center of everything. Why do you consider that person as a bearer of rights? Colonel Lustiger gave a lecture in New York about 20 years ago, when he used that old liberal line that your freedoms extend to the point at which you begin to injure others or affect others adversely. And you raise the question, do we mean all others? That is, are you assuming that everyone out there counts? Or is liberalism itself not backing into the principle all men are created equal? The center of the whole thing must be a question whether you consider that being a rights-bearing being, so that the taking of his life, restriction of his freedom, is something that calls out for justification. May I just say something else on this point?
Sure.
But first of all, this is one of those rare panels. I just love listening to everybody. But I just want to add something to Daniel. On matter of reason and the Jewish tradition. We had a back and forth at Princeton a few years ago, and our friend David Novak saying, it's all revelation. It's all revelation in the Hebrew Bible. We said, well, what about Abraham's encounter with God over Sodom and Gomorrah? So for the Lord of justice not himself be just? Can you not understand the wrong of killing the innocent? So when Abraham was raising that question, was he telling God, you're not clear on your revelation? Or is he appealing to a set of moral principles that he assumed everybody would know? See? Anyway, I'll drop at that with somebody else to pick up. Yeah.
Did you want each of us to answer the question?
You don't necessarily each need to answer, but if there's...
So, I guess I'll just throw in, well, picking up where Professor Arkes left off. I remember chipping in from the audience on that precise discussion, and as much as I'm indebted, and everyone in the Jewish tradition is indebted to David Novak, I actually do disagree with him on some matters with respect to natural law, largely along the lines that you're suggesting. I don't know if that gets too far into the weeds now, but I guess had associate myself more with the new natural law school, he more with the old natural law school. But I agree, I think that his is an unstable position precisely because he makes the case better than anybody else that there is natural law throughout the Bible, throughout the rabbinic tradition, and yet doesn't quite go far enough and kind of there's a voluntarism of sorts at the bottom. To come back to your question, and this takes it from a very different angle from Professor Arkes, so I apologize if I misread the question, but I don't know that, lacking a systematic philosophical tradition in the way that I've said, I don't know that Judaism has the anthropology to support one thing or another. Not that we couldn't piece it together, but it's not there on the surface. Having said that, there's a great teacher of mine who contrasted the Jewish view of the person to the Christian view of the person in the following way, and this will involve some stylizing, and I do apologize for that, but that the Christian tradition has both a lower and a higher view of the human person. So on one hand, the depravity of original sin, which is not a doctrine in Judaism, means that human beings are in one way or on some times or in some conditions, worse than Jews believe, even though Jews believe that there is no person without sin. And at the same time, because Christians have the doctrine of the incarnation, there's a sense in which humans can be divine, and not maybe only one human, but the idea that there is at least one human who is better than, more perfect than any of us mere mortals could be, and being in between. Now, to take it to your question, being in between, it's a matter of constructing a view of people that are both capable of reasoning to the truth without lacking the ability, or the kind of maybe the unfair version of Protestantism that I think Dr. Ballor was responding to, that depravity, that original sin, means that human beings can't use their reason and can't be trusted to use their reason. I think everything in the Jewish project, the Jewish intellectual project, makes it clear that Jews don't believe anything of that sort, and yet we also are suspicious of our abilities. There is no person without sin, and we are not divine and cannot be divine, and so maybe we need more divine instruction than we want to believe.
Trey, I'll say something on that question too, if you
Sure.
got time for it. Yeah, one of the things I was writing down over and over again as everybody was talking is things like human nature, shared, common. I took down the name of Hadley's book, Mere Natural Law, right? Is that the one that's coming out? And it struck me, that one of the greatest apologists and expositors of natural law in the 20th century was C.S. Lewis. He had a book, obviously, called Mere Christianity, where he's talking about the kind of core theological understandings of the Christian tradition. But that exposition was itself based on a kind of understanding that Lewis had and that Lewis shared and that Lewis understood to be Catholic in a small c of human nature itself. He explores that in various places, including notably the abolition of man. And it strikes me that another name for something like that kind of a project would be something like Mere Humanity, right? Where we're really focused on the common shared characteristics of the human person. And that's the nature that we're most focused on when we're talking about natural law in this moral sense, right? It's not a nature that's abstracted from or absolutely independent in every way from the broader created order or even God himself. And so that's another important thing that maybe we can talk about too, is how important is it defining that nature of the human person for there to be a natural law? There has to be a nature to talk about in relationship to some more transcendent reality. Is there any other way of defining a nature that can be stable? How much does the natural law have to be rooted, if not theologically, at least, in some kind of a transcendent way? And obviously, each of our religious traditions does that in a different way. So I've sort of answered a question with a further question, but I would say the human nature is the nature that we're talking about when we're talking about natural law in this technical sense.
So is this one of the challenges in Islam? That, obviously the Jewish and Christian sort of anthropological tradition is somewhat related, but I guess to some extent, being an Abrahamic faith, there's connections in sort of all the currents of Islam. But would this be sort of one of the challenges you have in sort of convincing those of your faith to...
the status of the human person?
Mm-hmm.
It's complicated, as you can imagine. First of all, compared to Judaism, maybe Judaism has one advantage in terms of making a sense of ethics beyond the law that is Noahite laws. Is that correct? There's the halakha, but then there's the Noah, laws of Noah that is valid for humanity, right?
Right.
So in Islam, what is beyond the Sharia, right? Is there something like that? Well, yes or no, depending on the schools that I told you. So it's interesting that Islam doesn't have a doctrine of the fall. There's the story of Adam, but it doesn't come with a strong emphasis on original sin, or there's no doctrine of original sin, which could be a basis for actually making an easier case for natural law. However, I think one thing that has been influential in Islam, which degraded the potential of sense of natural law, is the understanding that the pre-Islamic society, Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, was so dark that it was totally immoral and everything. So that's the Arab society before Prophet Muhammad came, and we know that they were pagans, they were polytheists, and they were burying their children, killing their newborn babies if it was a girl, because they want a boy. So they had these kind of it was a corrupt society, it's obvious. But does it mean all non-Islamic or pre-Islamic societies are corrupt, or was that specific society was that corrupt? So these things depend. Based on that, there emerged the idea that beyond Islam or besides Islam, everything was in darkness. So of course, one thing is important though. In Islam, Christianity and Judaism have always been given a fair share of ethics and legitimacy. Because there are criticisms of Jews and Christians, or Judaism and Christianity and Islam, but still they are the people of the book. They have a legitimate role. That's why they can have worship. That's why you can't force them to convert into Islam. They can have their churches and synagogues, which allowed in the pre-modern world a sense of religious freedom. That's why Jews escaped from Spain to the Islamic land. So at a time, it wasn't equal rights. So it was for its side. It was egalitarian. But beyond can we have equal rights? Can we have a basic human dignity? It depends on the concepts. The Ash'ari versus Mu'tazila, and all those different views there. I think there is a sense of human dignity for sure. The Quran says we have honored the children of Adam. It's not, there's no sense of human beings created in the image of God. That image of God, that doesn't go well in Islam, so no imagery here. But God has given Khilafah, his vicegerency, to every human being. So there are concepts there, but how much have they been nurtured and cultivated is a different question. So I think there are grounds for human dignity, and there are teachings there too, but maybe they have to be cultivated more for a mere humanity kind of perspective.
Sure. So another question that I have is that there's some consistency. There's sort of a lack of diversity, I should say, in this panel with regard to each of you is a serious adherent to your own faith tradition. It provides both a lens through which you sort of understand the natural law and vice versa. You're obviously a sort of a sympathetic representative of your tradition. And so we've made the claim in promoting this that natural law does not require, even demand, a particular religious perspective. And I'll go ahead and say, I'm actually the one that wrote that, so we don't need to blame Garrett if this turns out to be, sort of like language that doesn't live through this discussion. Do you think that that's actually sort of an honest claim? Does natural law, maybe theoretically, it's a system that can stand up to, sort of not having religious commitments, but in practicality is like the examples that you gave, Hadley, were people who were pulled into the church through a rediscovery of natural law, or they were, or their confidence in the church was re-inspired by an appreciation for the natural law. Can we actually have sort of the humanist? Could we have added a humanist to the panel who would say, well, I don't know about Aquinas, and I don't know about Moses, and I don't know about these Islamic people, but Aristotle, or some sort of completely a-religious formulation of natural law is something that they could embrace.
Well, it's when I was at Princeton years ago, when I was blessed to have Daniel as a student, we had a visitor there from, I think it was from Nigeria, remarking on this curious thing that there may be tribal conflicts, but the Christians were willing to live with the style of secular law. They were willing to live under a system of natural law precepts, right? So we don't, that can be. But again, you still, as I said before, what you can't get through the syllogism, you still have to explain why this character before you, when it was a cluster of cells or of growing up larger, why this is of someone who elicits your respect and your concern. And again, you don't quite get that from, as Mustafa said, you have people just destroying the children, burying the children, and so on. You don't get that from the classic tradition. Something else has to be supplied over there. By the way, may I, John gave a plug to Mere Natural Law, but I neglected to mention that course I mentioned, Political Obligations, gave rise to a book called First Things.
Which gave rise to a magazine.
And then it gave rise to Father Newhouse borrowed the title and the font for a new magazine. And
the royalties paid for all of this.
Oh, yes, that's right. I wish it could. But anyway, the point is, that was my first concentrated approach to the question of natural law. But I don't want to get deflect from Trey's question. You're saying, is it conceivable that you can have arrangements, cordial relations in society just simply on the premises of
secular natural law?
The Noahide laws, or what John Walter says, the second tablet in the Decalogue.
But the question. The question isn't, so I agree with what, first of all, thank you for the endorsement, and thank you for the endorsement. Well, the question we had the pearly guest said, no, Trey said I'm serious, so I'm in. But the question of we know historically or sociologically that for whatever reason, secular morality doesn't always. I mean, secular isn't fair. The pagan. I don't think we're going to call the pagans a secular morality, but right, it goes from back in the day killing children because they're born the wrong sex to nowadays killing children because they're the wrong sex. Somehow these things are with us. So sometimes I'll say to my students, what I do know is that historically the best vehicle for promoting and transmitting the kind of morality that we want to live with has been religion, for whatever the other flaws are. But I took it maybe that you were asking on a philosophical level, because I bet there's agreement among us that good religious communities are our best bet for a moral world. But I took it that maybe your question was on a philosophical level, like is the project possible if it's not grounded all the way at the bottom by what I think what I think you said, maybe explicitly, maybe in passing, that I forget, but that there's got to be at the bottom of this some kind of idea, either of the person created in the image of God or something else that's going to stand in. And if that's the case, then I think we have this. I think I'm too far gone down the new natural law train, and this is also Professor Arkes' fault, though not through that particular school of just saying that these are universal, that we can make this case without any theological presuppositions, that this is intelligible to everyone and applicable to everyone without belief in any particular God or without even belief in any God. And so far I'm still convinced, but I do understand why friends who disagree with that also have a good case that in order to understand, connecting to your first question, what kind of person we are, the kind of being we are, human nature, from which all of these other things about natural law follow, we can't really do that unless we have that theological view underneath it. And so I think it's a pretty good position. I just need more convincing.
Which theological view?
Well, whichever, something that's somewhere between the person created in the image of God or the person whose end, whose goal, whose purpose is to serve God, or something about grounding the understanding of the person in a relationship to God. So I think, right, is the grounding of our understanding of the person somehow in a relationship to God necessary for the natural law project. And while I still want to say no, because I think that's important to the universality of it, I do think that I'm convincible on this.
Well, when Tim kept Jordan's line, it's how does the creature of reason get? First of all, the creature of reason can get to natural theology. I think of Stephen Meyer's one, the return of the God hypothesis, that we can't account for the beginning of things with some other way. Now, that doesn't give us the personal God. Right. No, it doesn't give us the God who argued with Abraham over Sodom and Gomorrah, or the God who drew the Hebrews out of Egypt. But it's a long step towards it.
To dumb down Trey's question a lot, and maybe to kick it over to you guys, is if there were no God and there were no creation, but there were still human beings, would there be right and wrong? Right?
Well, Grotius says yes, of course, right? That great Protestant natural law jurist, right? That's his impious hypothesis, right? Which is a sort of a thought experiment and mostly misconstrued as arguing for a secular understanding of natural law that's divorced from these theological foundations. I guess my way of answering Trey's question would be to try to analogize or apply a kind of answer that I find in the Reformed tradition, applied in a slightly different, although I think complementary context. And so reformers like Calvin and others have this problem, this phenomenon they will have to try to explain about truth outside of special revelation narrowly understood. And often they'll talk about ancient Greek philosophy, for example, or there's a distinction between philosophical approaches to God or truth and theological or special revelation informed approaches. And they'll say things like, this formula actually comes up often, or variations of it, that especially with respect to truths about God, philosophical truths about God, that those who do not have special revelation, and they may be thinking particularly of figures like Plato, but it could be just philosophical approaches, they can come to some truths about God that are in some sense true. It's difficult for them to do it. It takes a long time for them to figure it out. Because it's difficult and it takes a long time to figure out, only a few can do it. because not all have the same kind of gifts or disposition or temperament or whatever. And it's always admixed with some errors. So there's a variation of this kind of formula. But even with all those qualifications, there's still an affirmation that, yes, there is something that is true. Maybe it only gets you to a partial natural theology from a Christian perspective or something like that. Right. But there is something, at least in theory, out there that can be perceived and acknowledged and have some practical consequences. And this is the kind of an exposition, a way of expositing Romans 1, for example. There are certain things about God that are available to all human beings and that do have some practical consequences.
On that, I mean, there is this interesting novel that is the beginning chapter of my book, Hay Ibn Yaksan. It was this philosophical novel written by Ibn Tufail, who was the teacher of, actually, Averroes. It's the story of a baby boy growing up alone on an island by himself and becoming a philosopher by observing the nature, and also then developing a natural theology, figuring out that there must be a creator, and even developing a sense of ethics, not to hurt the animals and so on and so forth. So without a society and revelation, Hay Ibn Yaksan becomes a self-taught philosopher. So this was written in 12th century Cordoba in Muslim Spain. It was translated into Latin and English and Dutch in the early Enlightenment and fascinated Enlightenment thinkers from Spinoza to Leibniz and Quakers, and it had an impact. So there's that's the tradition in Islam which says religion teaches us truths that are also knowable by reason. Not everybody can figure them out, but the philosophers maybe can do, and few people can do that. But religion gives the same truth to everybody, although the philosophers could figure out the same things. Of course, I think metaphysics is beyond that, but you can maybe say that for ethical truths, which would give us the sense of natural law.
Father Canavan used to say that, Frank Canavan used to say, you could take religion out of the schools, but you can't take away from students, children, the sense of religious wonderment. They wonder where it all came from. That question, something gives rise to that kind of question. Listen, Trey, I want to post an interest in raising a question down with Jordan later, because he really gives us a sense of the positive law versus the natural law in Islam. Because it's written, it is written there, how much weight to give to the text, and yet at the same time, there's an underlying law which I guess gives us the prospect of going, forgive me, beyond the text and appealing to the deeper principles to say, now maybe the text did not have it quite right. I'm just fascinated by that point.
Thank you so much. Or the text had a specific context which is not with us anymore. And that's the key argument there. Yeah, there was a commandment for fighting, but it was a specific situation, right? We're not, like, there was a commandment to fight the Amalekites, but we're in a different position right now, sort of.
So we can have casuistry, and we can reason about the things that set this case apart.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'd like to make a quick pivot, and this is a statement I'm reading from an article from the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion called "Natural Law and Protestantism: A Historical Reassessment and Its Contemporary Significance." And in the follow-up, we'll provide a link to this. But the authors, Jonathan Stonebreaker and Sarah Irving, say that Abrahamic religions would benefit from rediscovering their own natural law traditions, informed and grounded upon their own religious reasoning and religious sources, and utilizing the natural law tradition and language and providing them with a way of engaging with the pluralistic debate in the public square about questions of law and morality. So there comes a point when, we move from navel gazing to sort of there's something at stake, in working these things out and figuring out what we can agree on and move forward. So the question that I have is, who stands to gain the most as citizens in this? Is it minority faiths? Does this play into religious freedom? Or is it, or is this sort of, are we susceptible to a charge that this is like a backdoor to a return to Christian hegemony or something like that?
I'm
Any
sorry,
of you.
what's the background to?
To a return to sort of a Christian hegemony here in the West.
Rediscovering
Natural
Yeah,
law.
we discovered natural
Yeah.
law.
It's a covert,
Yeah.
Catholic conspiracy.
yeah, it's Catholic conspiracy. There you go.
Yeah.
So I didn't say that.
And the Jesuits survived it, I'm sure, right? Maybe I should have said that live on the.
It backs into the rule of those people who speak in sentences. Right.
Well, Protestants.
Okay.
Well, I mean, on one level, obviously, an appeal to the rule of law, to some higher standard, is going to be most salient for people who are experiencing the most injustice at any particular time. So in that sense, it could be all of us, but you can identify particular groups throughout history that have had this kind of really salient and concrete and efficacious appeal to the natural law. Martin Luther King famously, right? The letter from Birmingham jail in the context of the civil rights movement, and on, all kinds of injustices. So the natural law in this sense is it's a key tool for justice, for a just society. And of course, we all need that. It's good for everybody. And we all will need it, right? At some point or another.
No, Father Newhouse. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, on that issue, I don't think there's a Catholic conspiracy behind natural law argumentation, but I think from natural law you can still arrive at, I think, different ends, right? Different positions. And the recent discussions I've been hearing about this is that I see some integralist approach to natural law versus a more classical liberal approach to natural law. If the integralist approach is where the natural law takes us, of course there will be questions raised, and I'm sure Islamists will be very happy with that because they want their integralism to be emboldened by the fact that the same thing happens in the West too. So, whereas if it comes with a natural rights emphasis, natural rights is for everybody, right? I mean, natural rights is not for the Christians or the Muslims or the Jews or atheists, it's for everybody. So it depends, because I think natural law tradition had its own evolution in history, and I think we should not lose the track of that. So some of the people who might be referring to natural law might be going towards the integralist direction, as I understand, and I think that's not, that should be another discussion on and where natural law will take us.
Please.
No, Father Newhouse, in a famous essay, once raised the question: can an atheist be a good citizen? I say, sure, he can pay his bills, he can respect laws. But the question is, to be a good citizen, can you give a moral account of the regime? Can you give a moral defense of the regime? Now, if we begin by rejecting that scheme of no man is by nature the rule of others, the way God has made it, and there's a scheme here framing the whole matter. The alternative is some kind of relativism. It has to be, which is why the left now has made it clear that the enemy must be the churches. So if it's some kind of relativism, then you're saying, you as a citizen are free simply to vote out this whole demo. You could vote for the Nazis. You can vote for a party that will remove the whole structure of civic freedom. I said, well, without that, what do you say? If it's not Newton's law that tells you why that moon is hanging up there, and say, look, if this scheme of nature, God and man and the animals, that scheme doesn't explain these kinds of rights flowing to those rational beings, tell me what you're going to put in its place. See?
All right, so we do have some questions that are coming in from those who are watching at home, and the first one is specifically for you, Danielle. It's from Professor Helmholtz. He's asking an open-ended question here. Can you say a bit more about the relationship of natural law and positive law in Judaism?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Since we don't have the live audience to do the back and forth, I'm going to have to guess what the question means. If it's connected back to what I was saying before about the distinction between chok and mishpat. So I was referring to a source in the Talmud that notices that in the Bible there are different words given for laws. There's statutes, and I mean, these are all, of course, in translation, into English translation, but statutes and ordinances and whatever the variety of words, and always sensitive to textual anomalies or oddities. The Talmud is often asking, and the rabbis more generally asking, well, why all the different synonyms? And one of that verse is taken as an opportunity in the Talmud to introduce, not introduced for the first time, but to talk about the distinction again between the laws that I'll say we do understand and the laws that we don't understand. And the laws that we don't understand, we could kind of say ritual law as a rough and ready way to describe it. So that's surely divine positive law. So the idea that, again, one can eat the meat of a cow, but not the meat of a pig. So just God says so, and that's what we do. Can't eat shellfish, and a million other rules. But of course, the others, the mishpat, the ones that if they had not been written would have been written. Well, of course, that's also divine positive law. It's, as Professor Arkes said, it's the quote unquote the second tablet. Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, and so on. And there, it's certainly part of divine positive law, and that's why I think there's a debate among the rabbis about whether it's useful and prudent and pious to look for the reasons or not, because the fact that God commanded it is good enough for us, and that's really it. And so why bother with the reasons? On the other hand, the very idea that these are laws that if they had not been written would have been written is a suggestion that they are things that are right and that are, well, in this case wrong, I guess, as prohibitions, that are wrong even if they were not in the Bible, or they were wrong even before the Bible. And of course, Professor Arkes mentioned Abraham's argument with God over the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Will not the judge of all the earth do justice? Well, what in the world does that mean? God has just decreed the death of the people in these cities. Where is the injustice? Going back to the very first commandment, as it were, the commandment to Adam and Eve not to eat of the tree. Well, there's some divine positive law, and certainly there's no rational basis in the intrinsic sense. There's nothing intrinsically immoral about eating from that tree, and yet we have to assume, in order to make sense of the story, in order to make sense of the justice of God punishing Adam and Eve, if we are to read it as a punishment, which is certainly the plain meaning of the text, I think, then we have to assume that they had the capacity to understand that it was wrong to disobey God's command. That is to say, they had to be in possession of a natural law understanding of the wrongness of disobeying God's command. And if not, because if I had stumbled into the garden and said to Adam and Eve, "Don't eat from the tree," they'd just look at me and say, "Well, who the heck are you?" And take another bite. And it wouldn't mean anything. They'd be right to think that it didn't mean anything. So the fact of merely ordering it surely doesn't make it so. It's the fact that God ordered it, and somehow that puts an obligation on them. And so that's, in an extremely brief way, of course, my way of saying that positive law in Judaism can't make sense without natural law in Judaism, but also highlighting the fact that even the things that we think are natural law, the ones that would have been written even if they had not been written, still come to us as positive law, and we obey them as positive law, which then leads us to a question that I'll stop here, but a question about, what about the things that we think are part of our natural law understanding that aren't written? What purchase do those have within the tradition? And that's, of course, a much bigger topic, and maybe a question that answers itself by saying there is no such thing, but worth thinking about anyway.
So you're saying that say, things are restrictions on what kind of fabrics I can use, I think we could simply take the positive law there as instructed because they don't seem to raise any great moral
Yeah,
questions.
I don't know if the camera could catch it, it's so small, but it says right here, non-shotnays, because after I bought this blazer, which is mainly wool, I took it to shotnays checker to make sure that there were no linen threads woven in with the wool threads, because I can't wear a garment that has a mixture of wool and linen. Why? Because the Bible says so, and that's it. And it's a classic example of ritual law that we obey just because God commanded. And the rabbis do, you know, one of the commentaries says that, well, in pagan times, there was kind of pagan magic or black magic that they tried to do by weaving together elements of the animal world and the plant world together, and in the Bible's, you know, vociferous polemic against paganism and the instruction not to be like the pagans and to distance oneself from their practices. This is one of the things that's in there. But the Bible doesn't say that, and it doesn't matter whether that's even historically true. It doesn't matter whether that's relevant today. It doesn't matter any of those things. It's just shotnays, and so I won't wear it. Even to the point the Talmud says, if you find yourself in the middle of the street wearing a shotnays garment, you know, maybe a big like ancient poncho, you just got to take it off and walk naked in the street, rather than as modest as that is, because you can't wear shotnays. And so it's you know, it's as serious as anything that would be true in the natural law, and yet without a natural understanding. And no Jew thinks, I'm going on too long, I know, but I say no Jew thinks that non-Jews are obligated to refrain from wearing shotnays, or that a non-Jew does something wrong by wearing shotnays. That's not part of Judaism at all. And so it's explicit and I think unargued within the Jewish tradition that there's no moral principle in here at all, because if it were, then it would be something that would belong more like in the Noahide law, where you could say it's universal for all humanity.
Sorry about that. And where does Reform Judaism come from? Do they say, okay, this was the biblical rationale and we don't have to do it today?
Yeah, a bigger and a longer story.
So the heretics.
Obviously there was a very during the period of the Enlightenment, and this is not something unique to Judaism, but idea to say, well, let's see what's rational, let's see what's ethical, and let's preserve the ethics. And again, I can't in one sentence characterize Reform Judaism, do what I want to, but to say that the rituals, for one reason or another, don't apply today.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to something that mandates what's maybe strongly immoral, say God telling Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Let's see.
Sure. Let me answer. How many minutes there to answer the greatest theological question of all time?
Kant would say that wasn't the voice of God telling him that.
Right. But of course, that's not what we believe.
And Evil Falkenhayn would say he was testing Abraham, but when he told him to withhold his hand, he's saying, we withhold that hand for forevermore. We don't take innocent life. But
until Jesus.
Right. But what did you say? Following that Dick's question, so it shows that, is there some ground here which we appeal to the natural law to overcome at times what may be stipulated apart from fabrics, things like that?
No.
Okay.
And that's a problem. There are conflicts between. I recognize and live with the fact that the conclusions of the philosophers who do the kind of natural law that I like are not the same as the conclusions of the halacha in every case. And so I'm not going to take that up either, but it's real.
Okay.
All right. This question comes from Jonathan English. How would you say that Confucian teaching on the Tao, or the moral way, and the Analects can contribute to an appreciation of natural law, similar to the way that C.S. Lewis famously titled his appendix in The Abolition of Man after Confucius's Tao? Similarly, how would Confucius's teaching suggesting the appropriateness of remonstrance of authority and civil disobedience at times fit with the natural law tradition, including in the Analects and the classic of filial piety?
That's beyond my reach, I think.
That's Confucius.
I'm not an expert on Confucius.
No. Other than, that is obviously, that is an illusion that Lewis is trying to make in that postscript. Right. Of course, it's not simply Confucian content that's in that appendix to the Abolition of Man.
It's a rudiments of
to tie it back to mere Christianity, I think, and also I can't speak on Confucius, but that's the point. that Lewis is trying is that it's not an accident that we're going to find these things everywhere, right? That there are certain things that are common to all known human civilizations, now with their different parameters, of course. But then semester started yesterday, we're starting Antigone, pointing out that, right, every known human society has rituals around burial and ways that we respect the dead and honor the dead and treat a corpse in an appropriate way. Now, there's great variation there, but at the core, every single one recognizes that the corpse is not just trash. And so the fact that, without being able to speak about Confucius, I think it only reinforces the point that those of us on the natural law side want to make, that it's there too.
So, yeah, and the point is, it's not just about the concrete details of the judgment in a particular custom or culture, right? Lewis's larger point is that they all make these kinds of rules, as you were just saying, or have something that's analogous, even if they would draw the lines differently, or in one culture, it's wrong to do to do X, but in this other culture, it's right to do X. That actually isn't really an argument against natural law at the formal level, and that's one of Lewis's larger points, is that both are making these kinds of moral judgments. How you reconcile them is a different question, or how you explain how you get to that diversity is a different question. But the fact those kinds of moral judgments are universal in themselves is evidence for the natural law.
Yes, excellent. And so we have another question here at the beginning here. So this from Adam McLeod for all panelists. As Mustafa Akyol mentioned, some natural law thinkers argue that the concept of rights is a mistake and that civil rights are in tension with the natural law. Do you agree?
You could construe them in a way that they'd be in conflict, but I don't agree as a basis for... No, I don't think so. I think rights are actually best construed as corresponding to the natural law and the moral obligations that flow from it. Human rights, you could say, which have civil dimensions.
Yeah, I've never quite grasped it. You take what James Wilson and Kant and what Thomas Reid would consider the anchoring principle of moral legal judgment. We don't hold people. It doesn't make sense to cast moral judgments on people when they're powerless to affect these acts. We take that as a first principle. Now, if it means I have a right not to be punished because something was done before I was born, well, you might as well say people have a duty not to punish me for that. So, I mean, it seems to me, as John said, it translates into rights and duties. We're clear on the anchoring axioms that we could do it either way. If I have a right not to be discriminated against on the basis of race, if I have a right not to have my life taken on the basis of race, somebody else bears an obligation not to do these things. So, I remember, Lincoln's fragment was taken as an example of natural law reasoning and natural right reasoning. So I've almost never been confounded by that.
Now, I think what Adam's getting at too is there are these historical arguments where there are natural rights thinkers who are, in a sense, trying to take a step away from some kind of ontological or strongly transcendent grounding or theological grounding. So that, I mean, there is a way in which you could construe rights language to be that, but I don't think it's A, necessary, or B, historically tenable. I mean, the Christian tradition itself, I mean, are you talking about use versus lex? I mean, these are very closely related terms. They're not identical necessarily, but there's a basis in the Christian tradition for affirming both, certainly.
Yeah, I think it is a very good question. First of all, because there are those who are challenging, and we're talking about integralism before, and so are those who really just want to challenge the classical liberal concept of rights. Moreover, I think within people who disagree less with the line we've got here, I think there's also, Ryan Anderson has been excellent on this, but a reframing of how we talk about it to understand the way that rights are grounded in goods, and that we need a correct understanding of goods in order to have a correct understanding of rights. Right? Marion Glendon said years ago, and has a book about this, that of rights inflation, that now we live in a society where everything is a right, and lots of things that aren't rights are being called rights, and how do we sort sort this out and how do we make sense of it? And so even if at the end of the day we don't want to abandon the concept of rights, I think the one thing that, this isn't the heart of the question, but one thing that the question also raises for us is the importance of making sure we get that concept of goods correct, and natural law is indispensable for that, because that's where we're going to get it. And I would just say modestly that Adam MacLeod, being one of the greatest law professors in America and a substantial natural law scholar, I assigned his books in several of his books in several of my classes, was reading him on the way down here on the train. I would say that the JWI FLI next event should be having Adam come in here and answer that question. So that's my proposal.
You can call it a reformation of rights.
Look, as I say,
he is still Protestant.
The anchoring point here is we understand every act we can name can be directed to a wrongful, rightful end. We spoke about liberty and its violation of license. So my right to speak never entailed the right to fame. We understood that every act we can name comes along with moral restraints and moral conditions. And I've always read Locke, even Locke in that way. Locke says, you have a right to the work you've done with the fruits of the work you've done with your own hands, as long as you are the owner of those hands, right? If you're not the owner of those hands, someone else is the owner of those hands, then you... But of course, we had a judges who saying it doesn't make sense unless we regard that person as himself free and the owner of those hands. See, I don't see how even Locke gets around these things. See, I think the moral restraints and limits, I've always read them as being in place.
Okay. Well, so we have one final question. We'll probably end up in an abbreviated answer. But that's okay. We can at least get it out on the table and get a discussion going on it. So close to the beginning of the webinar, Danielle distinguished between internal and external aspects of the natural law. Would he and other panelists perhaps be willing to say something about those external aspects of the natural law tradition, historical or contemporary, the possibility, for example, the possibility to form alliances with liberalism and progressivism?
Alliances with the end. Alliances with
liberalism and progressivism. Yeah.
Should I take it first?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So I was hoping someone else take it first, and I'll think about it a little bit.
External and the internal.
But right. And so just to clarify, I think this was clear to the looking over Trey's shoulder. I think this is clear to the questioner. But just to for the sake of everyone. I was referring to the internal, the external stakes, which is to say, I think regardless of the question of alliances, there's a tremendous amount at stake internally in terms of debates within the Jewish community over tradition and change and so on, and whether we understand that there is reason behind the things that we do or not, and how willing we are to stick with things that we don't like, that we don't think have any reasons. Meaning in the area of ethics, not necessarily in the ritual law, where maybe that suggestion is off limits. But then externally, as the questioner suggests, I think that whether Jews are interested in and are capable of forming these alliances, in part depends on what they would. So I will, and Professor Arkes mentioned the topic of abortion, and I certainly know Orthodox Jewish people who think that abortion is wrong and themselves would not want to participate in or have an abortion, and yet who also think that it doesn't really matter what America's laws say about that, because as far as they're concerned, their community, the Orthodox Jewish community, will largely, it's not the same rules as in the church, but will largely stay away from abortion. Now, I think that's foolish on a lot of levels in terms of the mistake they're making about how much the culture in which they live will change them and change practices within the community, and certainly at the margins. But I think it's also the case that it's a failure to work together with fellow citizens to do what's right for everyone, if you don't see that. So I think they're wrong about the idea that they're safe from whatever's happening in the culture, but they're also wrong that they have no responsibility to make sure that the people aren't burying the children they don't want, or something like that. And so, sorry, just to remind myself of what. Oh, and as far as liberalism and progressivism, so I guess maybe one day. So I think it was Father Newhouse who had or Professor George, in fact, right, who said that in Clash of Orthodoxies, where he said that, well, it used to be, maybe a half a century ago in America, it was the Catholics versus the Protestants versus the Jews, and nowadays, and this book is already a couple decades old, and nowadays it's the Orthodox Catholics, Protestants, and Jews versus the less Orthodox Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. And so insofar as there can be alliances with progressives where there has to be agreement in the first place, otherwise, as I tried to suggest very briefly in my remarks, that it's not so much of whether we'll have an alliance where we can't agree on what the policy should be, but at least we can offer our fellow citizens an account of why we think our views should be imposed on them. And I know that some people think I'm too Rawlsian for saying things like that, but I think there is an extent in which to which we need to be able to say not just, well, we believe this and there's more of us than there are of you, so tough luck. Right. But instead, here's our reason, and we may disagree, but we've given you an account that you ought to respect, even if you don't ultimately agree. Just like we expect the same from you.
So I'd like to jump in here with a little bit of a moderator's privilege in the last few minutes and throw this actually to Mustafa. Danielle just mentioned, Protestants, Catholics, Jews, and so Islam is sort of outside of that calculus. Mm-hmm. What's sort of the promise that this would have for Islam in the West?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to emphasize that there is a Judeo-Christo-Islamic heritage out there, and these three religions have been intertwined and connected in various ways. And until the 20th century, you wouldn't think of there's a Judeo-Christian civilization versus Islam. Islam and Jews, Muslims and Jews had actually quite good history compared to some of the pogroms in Europe and so on and so forth. But speaking of the U.S., and the question, I'm not a big strategic advisor to anybody here, but here's what I can say. I see the American Muslim community, this is a very down to earth, it's not a theoretical question, but a very political. I see, for example, a lot of American Muslims who would be actually on the same value framework with conservative Christians on issues like abortion. Sure. But politically, they might be drawn to people who totally want full abortion and everything because of issues like immigration, or because they think that some of the people who are morally conservative are too skeptical of Islam and Muslims for the political reasons. So I think the political landscape a little bit is distorted because of this either or. Worries about Islamophobia, or we don't want every Muslim is a potential terrorist kind of voices that comes on the very extreme elements of the right, not certainly mainstream. But that has pushed some Muslims to ally with groups that they would not ally on a philosophical and theological basis. And I think it's important to break that, ice and build understandings, because I think it is very clear that Western Muslims, there are a lot of issues about the Sharia, but I can say that a lot of Western Muslims, including the most conservative ones, have jurisprudentially made peace with being a minority and accepting the law of the land. Just like Orthodox Jews, this is the law of the land is the law, Dina Malkuta, I think is that the term?
Yeah.
The same thing is in traditional Sunni Islam as well. So, and it's important to build these natural law basis, morality, traditional family values, alliances, I think, between traditional Muslim Jews and Christians in the West as well. And that is a little bit distorted because of some of the post 9/11 anxieties that are political, but not theological. And I believe we should work on, building those bridges.
Sure, absolutely. We are unfortunately out of time. We probably go on discussing these things for quite a while. But thank you for spending a couple of hours of your afternoon with us. For Mustafa, Jordan, Hadley, Danielle, we are very appreciative of your time and your wisdom. Please look for a follow-up from both the James Wilson Institute and the CRCD with more information about the things that you can be involved in going forward. In that follow-up will be links to both of Mustafa's books that I've referenced, as well as the article on Protestantism and natural law. Thanks so much again to our panelists and to those of you who've joined us. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it enlightening.
Thank you.